a lot to get through. But I think it's clear that as a profession, there is a lot of opportunity ahead for us as well. A lot of things we can do to improve what we're doing and to support more families and have a greater impact. So a lot to learn from that. Now, the afternoon, we've taken a bit of a different focus. So sitting down and talking to our mediators in the trust, it was very clear that we're seeing more complicated cases, more cases that are of higher conflict, that contain more domestic abuse type situations. Mental health issues appear a lot more readily. So we thought, well, let's focus the second part of the day on actually those big challenges that we're seeing in the mediation room regularly. So we've asked two speakers to come in and speak about that. So the first one was Professor Harold, and I'll let him give an overview of himself, but I think it's fair to say he's one of the leading sort of people out there, having recently taken over a post at Cambridge University, leading on looking at mental health in children and the impact of parenting and so forth around that. And I know when I put his name out there, a lot of mediators said, well, we've quoted him many, many times, so it'll be really nice to actually hear him speak and get into some of the detail. So I will now pass over to Gordon, and I'll just now start doing the screen sharing. So there you go, Gordon. Has something popped up to ask you to take control?
As we can control. I'll move my camera, sorry. Yeah, so I should have control, but nothing's happening for me, Mike, unfortunately.
Strange, it worked perfectly in practice, so I will take control and do it for you.
You're going to be busy with lots of animation here. Sound like
right.
Chris Ritchie by the end of this. Make him look better. Okay.
There you go.
Are you all set?
Yep.
Yes, sir. Okay. So good afternoon. Thank you so much for the invitation. It is a genuine pleasure to speak to you. As Mike said, I've had lots of engagement with the world of mediation, but I've not actually spoke to an audience of mediators to date. So it is a genuine pleasure to speak to you. I hope the presentation is all that you expect it to be. So as Mike said, so my name is Gordon Harold. I'm recently appointed as Professor of the Psychology of Education and Mental Health at the University of Cambridge. My research has historically focused on examining family relationship influences on child and adolescent mental health outcomes, with a particular focus on the interparental relationship and the parent-child relationships. And it's on that topic that I will focus my presentation today. I'll give a couple of caveats before I start. I'm a researcher. I'm a research scientist. I start by testing the opposite to what we think we see. It's called the null hypothesis. So if I sound a little bit sort of technical and boring and geeky, you'll have to bear with me, but that's what I do. I'm going to present some science and some research linked to the core proposals I'm making, which hopefully fit with your practice interests. So bear with me through that. But I thought I'd start by, if you go to the next slide, sorry, Mike. I thought I'd start by locating what I would suggest we have in common in terms of professional interests. So this is the dynamic between adults, between parents, between carers, that I have studied for the past 30 plus years. I appreciate I look very young. I started when I was about 5, in case people were my age. For about 30 years, I started my postgraduate training in the United States in 1991, so quite a long time ago. And I became interested in the question of the interparental relationship for child and adolescent development. And it was primarily at a time when the question of divorce effects on children were being examined systematically. But this captures what you see, or what you try to avoid seeing, I should say, in terms of mediation processes. But this is a dynamic that is very common, much more common in households than estimates or those in the policy world would necessarily like to admit. But it's a standard feature of domestic life. Not in every instance is this dynamic detrimental to children. Indeed, if children witness parents manage difficulty, adversity, conflict successfully or effectively or productively, they actually do quite well. So what I'm going to try to do is unpack this image, if you like, into live time and ask the question, does the dynamic between parents living together, not living together. And importantly, in a new sentence in this world, genetically related or not related to a child that they have caregiving responsibilities for. Does that dynamic matter for the child's development? If so, when, under what conditions does this dynamic influence children negatively? And by understanding the processes where some children, not all children, are affected adversely, what might we do to improve outcomes for children? Not just in terms of current quality of life or problems experienced at the instance of exposure to this, but we know that young people who experience exposure to adversity between parents, between couples, conflict between parents, between couples, are more likely to replicate that pattern of behavior in the next generation. And we have longitudinal evidence to back that statement up. So intervening in one instance may be preventing in another. And I want to make the case that actually understanding these processes may lay a framework where we not just improve outcomes for children in the short term, but we improve outcomes for families in the long term, future families. Sorry, Mike, one more time. Sorry. Yep. So sorry, go ahead, Mike, next slide, sorry. Yeah. So in the time available, what I will try to do is give you a very brief summary of research. I'm going to assume you know nothing about this area of research. I'm sure lots of people do, but I'll just start from scratch. I think the focus here really important is to make the link between the interparental relationship and outcomes for children, not just to focus on the interparental or inter-adult relationship, but on outcomes for children. And joining that link, which is an associative link, but nonetheless, the greater confidence we have about that association, the more effective we can be in terms of interventions. I'm going to present some research here that is UK and international based that tries to address that particular question. Is there an association? If so, how? And at the very end, I'll provide some examples of recent both practice and policy applications of this research that in terms of timeliness fits perfectly with the world of family mediation. So hopefully there's some opportunity at the end of the presentation. Next slide, Mike, sorry. Okay, so interest in mental health. Focus of the presentation is mental health in the context of mediation. Let me start by saying that family adversity, family distress is a strong correlate in relation to young people's mental health. By the end of the presentation, I hope the evidence will be such that we might go slightly further than just a strong correlate. At no point am I going to infer a cause, but I'm going to leave you to conclude the degree of association between conflict, domestic adversity, and child mental health outcomes. So currently mental health among young people, mental health generally as an area is recognized as an issue of significant national and international priority. Most recent estimates, end of 2020, is that 1 in 6 children and adolescents experience serious mental health problems. Mental health as a domain costs just over £100 billion per year in the UK, and by 2030 is expected to cost $16 trillion globally, with depression being the primary indicator of cost manifestations, cost impacts. These numbers are generated pre-pandemic. So we know that these numbers are now likely a significant underestimate of mental health impacts, individual and society. And particularly for young people, we know that the current cohort of age 4, slightly younger, and age 18 and also slightly older, will be very directly hit by pandemic impacts and likely to last for over 20 years in terms of long-term effects. UK rates of depression, anxiety, self-harm, substance misuse, suicide are among the highest in economically well-off countries in the UK, primarily compared to OECD countries. We know numbers are going up in terms of serious mental health problems. It's not just a reporting issue, they are going up. Recent estimates using linked dates at the GP records shows that children aged 7 to 9 years are reporting and being identified as having higher rates of self-harm. Age 7 to 9 years, self-harm. Associated problems, anxiety, depression, conduct problems, substance misuse, suicide, and related problems are also evidence to be on the increase, in particularly among young people. At the end of 2020, in October 2020, it's called the Good Childhood Report, which comes out approximately every 5 years. Located children living in the United Kingdom, aged 10 to 15 years, is doing least well among their peers in comparison to 24 other countries. That's the third report with this focus over a 15-year period, locating children in the UK as doing least well in multiple areas of well-being in comparison to other OECD and economically well-off countries. So the state of UK's children's mental health in the UK has for a long time been an issue of significant concern. And I would suggest it's time we started doing something significant to improve that ranking, rather than simply report that statistic over another 5 years. We know that 75% of serious mental health problems, serious adult psychiatric disorder, that symptoms are in place before the age of 18 years. So identifying mental health as what we call the lifespan, or employing a life course perspective, is essential. We don't just see mental health problems in childhood or in adolescence or in early adulthood or in late adulthood. We tend to see developmental cascades where those problems become worse, more severe over time, and if not supported early, set the stage for very serious problems later in life, and the transmission of those problems across generations. We know that mental health is a significant pillar in terms of education attainment, physical health, and future employment. So increasingly recognizing the role of mental health as a substantive influence on other areas and outcomes is now essential. It's not simply an academic proposal, it is absolutely fundamental to improving outcomes across multiple domains. Very simply, factors that affect mental health, child and adolescent mental health outcomes in particular. We know genetic factors are important, neurobiological factors are important, brain development, and environmental factors are important. Environmental factors, families, schools, communities, and multiple other environmental factors we know affect mental health and well-being more broadly. We also know these factors don't just occur in childhood, don't just occur in the early years, they work together across the lifespan, and that actually interventions later in life can be substantively effective in improving outcomes for children and young people, not just the first 1,000 days, as is often quoted as the window of intervention opportunity. Interventions in foster care and other high-risk contexts in adolescence later in life show significant improvements. So we know interventions work at later stages of life as well. A focus on environmental factors. So I mentioned family, school, community. I'm going to focus on the family really in terms of this presentation, but that's not negating the importance of school and other social environmental factors in terms of promoting and also adversely affecting children's mental health. Standout factors in terms of effects on children, young people, and mental health. When I say mental health, I'm going to primarily refer to implicitly depression and conduct problems, but I'll specify other variants of mental health problems as I progress. So we know economic stress, household economic stress, economic pressure is a factor linked to child and adolescent mental health outcomes, parent mental health, parenting practices and processes, early attachment processes, parenting style processes, authoritative, authoritarian, permissive, etc. And the parental relationship is a factor well documented in terms of correlates, as a correlate, I should say, in terms of child and adolescent mental health. Research in the area of family relationship impacts on children has historically focused on relationship status, marital status, exposure to domestic violence, and parenting practices. That's the primary clusters. Other areas, yes, they're the primary process factors, if you like, event factors in terms of links to child and adolescent outcomes. Very quick sort of summary of 20 years of research. We know that the dynamic between adults, between parents, between couples is increasingly being seen as a factor that explains effects, well-documented effects in terms of outcomes for children. So presently, it's estimated that divorce occurs in just over 1 in 2 cases. So I know I'm being recorded, I say this slightly tongue-in-cheek, I don't mean in a negatively or in a trite way, but now marriage is a significant risk factor for divorce. 1 in 2, greater than 1 in 2, will likely end in divorce. We know that conflict between parents that occurs before, during, and after separation and divorce explains the greater proportion of variance in children's adaptation to parental separation. So while the event itself is distressing, evidence from Mavis Hetherington and colleagues in the 1980s, 1990s, early 2000s has shown that approximately across a 2-year window of adaptation, levels of conflict before, during, and after explain maladaptation or lack of adaptation to the event of divorce, more so than the event itself per se on outcomes. Also in the context of domestic violence, that again, research in the 1990s plus has shown that children who witness violence, as compared to being physical victims of violence, also experience significant distress. So there was a shift, if you like, into looking at the particular dynamics, the processes that underlie both the event of parental separation and divorce, and in the context of domestic violence, to better understand how children are affected, why some children are affected more so than others, and importantly, why some children show resilience to both those events and experiences. Research from the 1990s plus by actually looking at, in the context of divorce, what aspects of conflict linked to divorce were associated with poor outcomes for children. And if those aspects of conflict between parents were expressed in intact households, what outcomes were noted for children? So researchers began to look at the dynamic of the relationship between parents in intact households to better understand those processes, and then extend into the context of divorce to look at the continuity of those experiences before, during, and after, and associations in terms of child and adolescent mental health outcomes. So the phrase is used, silence to violence. It's research that that's a phrase I've used over the course of the past number of years to harness the measurement of interparental conflict. Silence being low overt physical, verbal negativity, expressive negativity, but low warmth, low positivity. So lack of the standout risk factors in terms of identifying an at-risk dynamic, if you like, to highlighting where there's a complete lack of positivity and warmth in that relationship. It actually is a correlate of poor outcomes, mental health outcomes for children, right the way through to violence, both verbal and physical violence, with well-documented associations there. So along that continuum, that U-shaped curve, if you like, high negativity, but non-physical negativity to high negativity to physical measures as physical negativity. Along that continuum, how does conflict between parents affect children? Sorry, Mike, I keep trying to do that. You can go to the next slide. So this is a model. People who have seen me speak will have seen this model previously. Just hit the slide one more time, Mike. Sorry, this is where you're going to be pressed. That's perfect. Where in the late 1980s, early 1990s, researchers began to look more closely at the variable that is interparental conflict and the dynamic between parents, in particular within intact households, to better understand its role within a wider context of adverse family experiences. So I mentioned economic stress, I mentioned parent mental health, parenting, interparental conflict, each respectively serving as a correlate to poor outcomes for children. So what outcomes do we see? Sleep problems, early sleep problems, conduct problems, academic problems in the slide, and the image at the top, depression and intergenerational transmission of depression. So researchers in the late 1980s, early 1990s, Rand Conger and colleagues in the Midwest United States, building from work by a guy called Glenn Elder, who wrote a book called Children of the Great Depression. Some people may be aware of that book. If you're not, you should look it up. The term lifespan, life course development has come from that body of work, Glenn Elder. These researchers working in the Midwest United States with the expectation there would be a policy change in that state in the late 1980s, which would put significant numbers of rural farms and households under economic pressure, set up a longitudinal study to examine the mechanisms through which that event or those events might affect families with a particular focus on adolescent children. And what they observed, this is not just an observation, this is longitudinal data, systematic longitudinal evidence replicated in multiple European countries, wider international context, that where households experience economic or work stress. So I'm going to start to align as much as I can to the mediation context. So for example, financial stress, financial arrangement would be a standard factor of conflict in terms of mediation process. So where there's economic stress or economic pressure, particularly a change in economic circumstance or an expected change in economic circumstance, this is not poverty or extreme economic adversity. This is day-to-day, making ends meet on a day-to-day basis, being worried about finances. But where that factor was measured and present, there's an association short and long-term to child mental health outcomes, specifically children's conduct problems. Interesting, when these researchers then went one step further, if you can go next slide, Mike, next link. That's it, just stop there. That actually, the important thing is where you see a red line disappear, this is what we call a mediated process. In other words, something is explaining that original association. So there was a link between economic pressure and child mental health outcomes. When the researchers measured adult mental health, particularly paternal, maternal mental health and depression specifically, the association between economic pressure and outcomes for children disappears, it's mediated. So that association is explained by depressive symptoms experienced by fathers, by mothers. In the late 1980s, paternal depression and anything to do with family process is a completely new area of inquiry. So this is looking at mothers and fathers, their mental health symptoms and outcomes for children. Next link. Researchers went a step further and show that actually where there's economic stress, the mechanisms through which initially stress affected outcomes for children was mediated by adult depression. But when you put in parenting practices, that factor mediates a link from adult depression. So economic stress affects adult depression, which in turn affects parenting, and in particular parent-child neglect, So being less attentive, less engaged, less consistent, less responsive, less nurturant, less positive, which is in turn associated with child mental health problems, particularly child conduct problems. So there's a phrase used in literature called coercive family process. This research is the origin of that term, that actually parent-child neglect, poor parenting, inconsistent parenting is associated with child conduct problems. Child conduct problems might facilitate more challenged parenting back to child conduct problems, so you get what's called coercive family process. So Jerry Patterson is the author of that term. These researchers, interestingly, also measured the quality of relations between couples. If you hit the next slide, or link, I should say, and one more time, the box should appear around that. Okay, so in this study, interparental conflict was measured probably one of the first times longitudinally, quite comprehensively. And this is where my own work and others came in the early 1990s, John Gritch, Frank Fincham, and others. And a paper by Paula Matter in 1991, Patricia Keith, in reviewing the under what conditions divorce affects variation in children's mental health outcomes. The reviewers identifying 5 main areas. One of them being the dynamic between couples. That was a conflict between couples. So we, in this study in the late 1980s, asked questions about the interparental relationship, but specifically about the dynamic occurring between parents. So important to say that where conflict between parents, couples is normal, happens in most households. However, this is important kind of language, when conflict is measured as frequent, intense, poorly resolved, and child-related, there's consistent associations with mental health outcomes for children, young people, across all ages. A study not so long ago, maybe about 5 years or so ago now, a replication of an earlier study showed that children as young as 6 months where they were exposed to audible exchanges between their actual biological parents versus unrelated adults showed elevated heart rate. So from a very early age, children can pick up what's happening around them in terms of environmental effects. And where they report, or it can be observed, that conflict is frequent, intense, poorly resolved, and child-related. There's a consistent association, an array of developmental outcomes for young people. So this model suggests that economic stress, when affecting adult mental health, the mechanisms through which children are affected, is an escalation in conflict between parents, which in turn affects parenting practices, which then influences children's mental health outcomes. You might conclude from this figure that parenting, parent-child support, parent-child neglect, and therefore supporting parenting, is the primary mechanism through which outcomes are influencing children. Very important piece of research, again in the 1990s, showed that where you support parenting and parent-child dynamics in the context of intraparental conflict, if you hit the next slide, Mike, that actually, oh no, sorry, you need to go back, just there. That actually, if we support the parent-child relationship in the context of conflict, but don't address the conflict, there are continued effects, adverse effects for children. And actually supporting parenting in the context of intraparental conflict, there are limited sustained effects in terms of outcomes for children. So targeting parenting as a starting place by family support, where there's conflict, may be simply too late in the process. Longitudinal intervention studies back this up. Supporting the interparental relationship and dynamic between couples not only improves long-term outcomes for children, but actually improves parenting practices without targeting the parent-child relationship. Parent-child relationship support programs that do not target the interparental relationship and where there's high levels of conflict do not evidence sustained effects in terms of outcome. It's a very important statement. UK policy has changed only in the past few years, but it makes a point that actually intervention may need to start at the level of the couple relationship, specifically around conflict dynamics, if we are to see improvements in parenting and if we are to support children's mental health outcomes. So just very quickly, a piece of research to back that up, and then I'll move on. So next slide. Just to locate this research area within a UK context. So a study that I led in 1990 now, I think was the first year, sorry, 1999, 2000, 2001, going back quite a while. But nonetheless, I want to just use this research as an example into the relevance and significance of the, certainly the voice of the child literature in particular. So this is a study that was set up to follow children who were transitioning into secondary school, and particularly to look at this link between secondary family support and school support as children made that transition. This looks at, again, the same measures I mentioned previously in the US study, measures of frequent, intense, poorly resolved and child-related conflict as reported by children and as reported by parents. And uniquely, we had access to, I can put mental health measures up here, we had access to key stage 3 scores to examine whether or not these family dynamics actually impacted a substantive developmental outcome event, if you like, and that's academic attainment, standardized academic attainment. This was to get past challenges around looking at what are called internalizing problems, emotional behavioral problems, externalizing problems, behavior problems, and suggesting these problems themselves may be a factor within the family, and therefore how do you disconnect that in terms of these processes. So academic attainment is a set of standardized scores was an opportunity to look at these links. Theoretically, if you hit the next link, Mike will be busy now for a while, then you'll get a break. Theoretically, we've got two main mechanisms of support and intervention historically in working with children who may need support, families. So first is supporting parenting. Conflict between parents may affect children through parenting, which was the previous slide. Next slide, Mike. That conflict between parents may lead children to behave more aggressively, which in turn may adversely affect academic attainment. And the next one, and this is the more recent evidence, late 1990s, where children's own perceptions and appraisals of their parents' relationship dynamics are measured, asking questions about the frequency of their experiences, how intense exchanges occur, resolution attributes, and child-related attributes, using a questionnaire validated for use from children age 7 plus up to age 18. Where children ascribe self-blame, attributions, and responsibility for their parents' relationship difficulties, this factor seems to be most consistently present in associations with mental health outcomes, anxiety, depression, and conduct problems, where they hold themselves, where they feel at fault for. When my parents quarrel, there's usually nothing I can do to make myself feel better. I feel at fault for my parents' quarrels. My parents quarrel or argue about me a lot, etc. Okay, so we've got three mechanisms. I'm going to test two key mechanisms. So next slide, Mike. We'll come back to that. Next slide. It's just there. So the first, this is theoretical. First hypothesis that conflict affects children by adversely affecting harsh rejecting parenting, which may directly affect academic outcomes, or via aggressive problems, children's own behavior problems. Next slide. Next, Mike. And again, so when we test that, a bold line just means it's significant. A dashed line means it's not significant. When we test that, the only way you can get from interparental conflict to academic attainment through bold lines is interparental conflict to harsh rejecting parenting to academic attainment. You see that? Yeah. Yeah. So the site of intervention there would be parenting. Next slide, Mike. And again, and that's it. Stop. So when we bring in a measure that looks at children's own appraisals for their parents' behavior, again, you have the same pattern. We can only get from conflict to academic attainment via that measure of children's perceptions. Do you see that? Really importantly, the first hypothesis, you're targeting support at the level of parenting. The second mechanism, you're targeting support at understanding how conflict is affecting outcomes via children's own understanding. It's an entirely different source of intervention and explanation mechanism. If we put these two together, Mike, so we test them simultaneously, how do you get from conflict to academic attainment through bold lines? You can only get there through perceptions of self-blame and responsibility. See that? So when we put the mechanisms of supporting parenting or supporting children's understanding of what's happening between parents, it's the latter mechanism that explains effects on outcomes. This was quite a discipline shifting, I guess, paper when it first came out in 2007, replicated several times now. But it's essentially saying that if you're supporting parenting or supporting children's behavior problems in the context of interparental conflict, two standard intervention sites, you're completely missing out on the mechanism through which children are affected. Yeah? Next slide. Okay, I'll be quick to go through this because I want to make an important point. Challenges to any assertions around family environmental effects, interparental relations, parent-child relations, etc., emanated in the early 2000s. And yet I was asked a question at a conference in the early 2000s presenting the study I've just put up, where the question was asked that the vast majority of evidence we have looking at aspects of the parent-child relationship, the interparental relationship, and outcomes for children primarily involve biologically related parents and children. and actually what you may be seeing in terms of problems being presented, and particularly the intergenerational transmission of problems, maybe because parents and children share genes. It's what's called passive gene environment correlation. So if I look at that figure, parent-child discord, parent-child neglect, parent-child conflict, and child problems, and there's aggression in the level of the parent-child relationship, and there's aggression in terms of child behavior problems, the proposal can be that association is because of shared genes passed on from parents to children. Very important point. Children in transition to households, step-parent households, etc., may be living with biologically unrelated parents, guardians, relative to children versus biologically related parents and children. It's an important question. When I was asked the question back in early 2000, might it be the case that these associations are simply explained by shared genes, and what does that mean? The answer is, well, possibly it might be explained. What does it mean? It means a core mechanism through which we see these behaviors transferred across generation may be biologically driven. And we need to better understand the role of environment relative to those biological factors. It's got significant implications: adoption, foster care, step-parent households. Does the environment really matter in terms of expressing the outcomes that we're trying to improve? Take much longer to go through all of these. That question was asked in the early 2020s. It was answered about 15 years later, 13 years later in a published paper, and about 15 years later when I went back to the same conference with some data, and my answer being probably not. And I actually framed the question: can the association between aspects of parenting or the parent-child relationship and child outcome be explained simply because children and parents share genes in the vast majority of studies we have to work with? If you go to the next slide, very quickly, sorry. So to put this succinctly, if we can examine the links between dynamics between couples, parents, between parents and children, where children and parents are not genetically related, we can remove the confound of what are called shared genes. Of course, genes at the individual level absolutely linked to variation in behavior, but it's the association between an exposure variable such as negative parenting or interparental conflict and child outcomes there when children and rearing parents are not genetically related. Do you get that? Someone nod, got a few nods, okay. So I'm part of two studies, thankfully, international studies. One is called the Early Growth and Development Study, which quite uniquely is a longitudinal study of children who have been adopted, but importantly, children adopted at birth. So the lag time to placement is not an issue, as is an issue in a lot of adoption studies in terms of looking at other confounds. 2.5 day lag time to placement in this US study. And a separate study set up in the United Kingdom with a colleague, Anita Thapper, myself, who, a longer story, it was noted actually through conversation with a family member who went to in vitro fertilization, that if that family relatives had been successful, the father would not have been genetically related to their child, or if twins children. So through in vitro fertilization, it's actually possible to identify 5 core groups: a group of children fully genetically related versus groups where rearing dad, rearing mum, or neither rearing parents are genetically related. So we have 2 designs where there's an adoption at birth and adoption at conception for a subgroup of children and parents, and we can examine this association. And next slide, and this is the last technical slide, and then I'll finish. This is, if you just look at the top part of this slide, interparental conflict, mother-child hostility, mother-rated child conduct problems. That's the early boxed off figure we had previously: interparental conflict, parenting, and child outcome. These numbers, these coefficients, represent 2 groups. The orange coefficient is using the UK IVF study, so children, homologous subgroup, I should say. So children and rearing parents are genetically related. And the blue coefficient is using the United States adoption at birth study. So children and rearing parents are not genetically related. So if you look at the link between mother-child parenting hostility and child conduct problems, 0.32, 0.31. In the first coefficient, the orange coefficient, children and rearing parents are genetically related. Blue coefficient, they are not genetically related. Coefficients are exactly the same. You see that? So in the case of the blue coefficient, shared genes can't explain that association. So like I said, it took a long time to answer the question, but the association between a rearing variable, an environmental factor such as parenting practices and child outcomes, are not explained by a group of children and brain parents who are genetically related. There's no, shared genes don't explain that. If you step down to the father-child association, the actual magnitude numbers here are incidental, 0.39 and 0.44. Again, same pattern. Parenting practices affect children's conduct problems, whether you're genetically related or not, across groups. Really important. Just a step back to the left side of the figure. Interparental conflict, again, measured frequent, intense, poorly resolved, or child-related, associated both with mother-child parenting practices and father-child parenting practices. You see that? Once there's asterisks, they're significantly associated. So the roots to interparental to child outcome, again, are operating through parenting, whether you're genetically related or not related. In terms of your particular interests, family court and mediation interests, the number 0.19 of the two plus signs there, that association measures of conflict between parents and parenting. With the IVF sample, we can look at quite unique genetically related and unrelated groupings. Related mothers and children, and unrelated fathers and children. Related mothers, unrelated mothers, related fathers, unrelated fathers. Yeah. The plus signs there are indicative that that association, conflict between parents and paternal child parenting practices, that association is significantly different in every grouping compared to mothers. Significantly stronger compared to mothers. The association is there for both. Conflict affects both maternal parenting practices and paternal parenting practices. But the degree of overlap between conflict at the couple level and conflict between fathers and children is consistently stronger. Can you think of parenting programs that target the father-child relationship as a correlate to the interparental relationship? So again, in terms of interventions that target one relationship relative to another and don't make the link, and indeed that just focus on parenting as compared to the association between relationship dynamics at the couple level and parenting, miss out on the mechanism through which children are affected. This research came home to me in terms of its qualitative significance when an adoptive mum spoke to me and said it was the first time she'd been presented with evidence to suggest that both her parenting practices and her relationship with her spouse and her son's father mattered. That there was something about what she did that was more important than the genes passed on from bio parents to child. And I hadn't appreciated just how absent that key bottom line message was for families, parents outside of biological contexts, IVF, step-parent, adoptive families. Your parenting fundamentally matters. And the dynamic within the household as it links to parenting fundamentally matters in terms of outcomes for children. Next slide. Really there. I'm going to move through this fairly quickly. So I'm quite happy to share this. This paper, which came out in 2018, sort of summarizes all of that research. But at the very back of the paper, there's a section on policy and practice implications, and specifically implications for family court practice, and specifically implications for supporting at-risk families outside of a family court or parental separation context. If you go to the next slide, Mike. This is a quite complex figure, but I'm just going to walk through. So if you hit the next, just next one, Mike, and again, and again, and again, and again, and pause there. You can trace a route whereby if interparental relationship support is introduced early, intact households, non-intact households, that actually the costs associated with parenting programs, the costs associated with child behavior specific programs, the costs associated with academic progress programs, and the costs associated with later difficulties entering the workforce or adult mental health problems, that cascade that we just flowed down will be significantly interrupted. So costs need to be understood as a cascading framework, not simply cost-benefit type models. Pound invested here equals X pound saved. But the cumulative cost saved by effective prevention, early intervention at the relationship level, significantly interrupts the need for supports and interventions later in life, which are significantly more costly. And in terms of your particular interest, next link, Mike. Of course, interparental conflict fundamentally affects the propensity and the process through which parental relationships break down. So not supporting the relationship between couples, between adults as they separate relative to child outcomes, fundamentally misses out on the mechanism ultimately through which those young people are affected and through which they're likely to replicate behaviors over time. Next slide, Mike. And again. And that conflict, again, in terms of big cost areas, domestic violence, adult depression, substance misuse, and relationship breakdown is a common denominator, and evidence robustly underpins that statement. So supporting relationships intact en route to separation, fundamental to not just improving outcomes for children, but actually improving outcomes for adults, and breaking down patterns such as violence, substance misuse dependency, serious mental health problems, and related problems. Next slide, Mike, and I'm nearly there. I'll let you read through this very briefly. I want to go on to the next two slides, if you bear with me for a few minutes. So this summarizes the evidence presented and also in that earlier paper, 2018. But it makes the point that conflict between couples affects children in an array of domains: emotional, behavioral, social, and academic. That actually not just the event or occurrence of conflict between parents, but really importantly, children's appraisals and understanding of that conflict. Children are hugely astute observers of behavior. We know from the domestic violence literature, they will pick up the propensity for violence to occur well before its occurrence, based on experience. We also know that children in households where violence is not a feature, but where conflict is a feature, can describe signals in advance of the occurrence of conflict. And their understanding of the whys, the likelihood, and the implications for them of that conflict absolutely operate as a factor through which their related outcomes are explained. So staying together for the sake of the children, going into another room, fighting away from the children, doesn't work. Children, hugely astute observers. So the term voice of the child needs to be more than just saying what they're experiencing, but recognizing that children are observers of behavior, hugely sophisticated and astute observers of behavior. They may not tell you what they're seeing or hearing. If asked, they may be able to describe, but their experiences to perceptions and appraisals fundamentally explain effects on their outcomes. Supporting parents, supporting couples, we now know through longitudinal intervention studies, not just improves outcomes for adults themselves, but significantly improves outcomes for children. Supporting the interparental relationship improves both parenting and outcomes for children. So I want to describe quickly two policy areas, one a practice area specifically linked to the family court, and a more recent program which you'll probably be aware of called Reducing Parental Conflict Program. This research has facilitated in terms of promoting practice and hopefully informing future policy. So next slide, Mike, and then I'm done. So earlier there was reference to Cafcass Cymru, Cafcass Wales, just to summarize this, and I'm very happy to follow up and give more details on this particular partnership. So back in 2002-2006, Adoption and Children Act shifted so that seeing or hearing ill treatment and others is a child protection issue. A person I hold in huge regard, Matthew Pennell of Cafcass Cymru. People may know Matthew Pennell from Cafcass Cymru. Came and spoke to me. I was a very young lecturer sitting in my office, and he wanted to know if it was possible to assess seeing or hearing ill treatment of another, with a particular focus on the interparental relationship. It was a much longer conversation. The question was put to Matthew: do you want a book that, you want a product, I should say, that has a cover that looks like it's doing that, or do you want it actually to do that? And he said, I'll get back to you. And he came back 6 weeks later and said, we'd like the latter, but we're not sure how much it's going to cost. The short answer was I was seconded to Cafcass Cymru for 2 years and spent time working with Cafcass Cymru in a practice context to better understand actually what went on in households and the Cafcass officer's core role. And we developed what's called the Child and Adolescent Welfare Assessment Checklist, which is a very comprehensive questionnaire suite covering interparental, parent-child, mental health outcomes, where practitioners are trained on the assessment of family dynamics, interparental, parent-child, child and adolescent mental health, and where they're in a position to write a one-side A4 report that goes into court. In a trial of this particular assessment package, a family court judge summarized that in a particular case, it was processed in 15 minutes, not 6 months, based on the application of the COWAC. This is specifically in the context of private law. A review in 2016 of just over 600 cases where the COWAC had been used show that 80% of young people assessed evidenced significant mental health problems that would not have been picked up or assessed in standard practice. The relationship with CAFCAS Cymru goes on. We have training every 6 months with their latest practitioners. We have one in June, and I'm very happy to follow up for those interested in this in terms of wider family mediation. Almost there, Mike, sorry, and I'm going over time. And for those who are not aware, worth looking up, Reducing Parental Conflict Program, which is a program led by the Department for Work and Pensions, launched in 2017, very specifically looking at providing intervention support for families. In terms of initial eligibility, this was those experiencing economic hardship or worklessness specifically, as it was defined back in 2017, which is now open to a wider set of eligible families. But through Department for Work and Pensions engagement and process, with a focus on child and adolescent mental health, there is a referral pathway through to intervention programs, specifically in terms of theory of change, engaging the adult relationship, adult mental health, parenting, and child and associated child outcomes. The intervention is not with the child, the intervention is with the parent, the carer, the adult. Current conversations, it was mentioned earlier about family hubs. Current conversations around this program are to look at extensions of the program into education, health and social care, and specifically family courts. So this conversation is live. This very last bullet point there only went on this slide about 3 weeks ago. So a very useful conversation to be part of as we get this program and its logic model, interparental conflict influences children, into practice and potentially into a family court context more broadly. And next slide, Mike. And I'll finish there. I'll let you read through this slide for yourselves, but top part of the slide, interparental relationship, mental health outcomes for children, pervasive across all ages. Interparental conflict is a core factor, explanatory factor in parental divorce effects on children. Not recognizing that now puts practice significantly behind the evidence line. What happens between couples, parents, that fundamentally affects the experience children have across the process of parental divorce separation. A main area of contention in the mediation context, finances and child access arrangements, among others, the latter being absolutely fundamentally child related. So the issues that parents may be raising, can you identify them as having particular salience for children? The more child related, the more manifestly relevant to child outcome. I would ask the question in terms of mediation, how much of this evidence is part of your training, is part of standard practice? Might there be scope for engaging this evidence in terms of training and practice? And looking in particular at the CAFCAS Cymru example, there are existing materials that are quite easily adaptable to context that could be looked at. Some work in New Zealand that I was part of did exactly that. One of the key findings was that when the mediator was able to introduce to distressed couples the impacts in a way that was sensitive on their children, particularly around mental health, there was more willing engagement to resolve and rectify conflicts and issues pertaining to conflicts, I should say. One last warning shot, I guess, is evidence comes in many forms. I think be very careful to differentiate eminence-based recommendations from evidence-based recommendations. They don't always go hand in hand. There's a huge amount of evidence emerging in this area now that I think has substantive implications for your practice interests. And I'd be very happy to have ongoing conversations to help promote engagement where that was of interest. Sorry, Mike, I've gone over time. Did my best. I finished. Thank you. I can't hear anybody. Well, I've lost all sound, Mike, if you can hear me. I can't hear you at all.
Sorry. Sorry.
There we are.
Thank you. That was a really helpful presentation. I think every mediator will have taken something out of that. I just wanted to sort of just pick up a little time for questions. We'll make time to ask any questions. So does anyone have any specific questions they'd like to chuck in? I'm specifically asking Claire, as she gave me your name initially as someone that we must get on board. Is there any questions to put forward?
Well, no, not questions as such, but I am a top fan.
Well, there's a fan page, is it now then?
And Harold, although he doesn't know it. And I learned his work training were both here. Can you hear me?
No,
Yes,
I just heard top fan. I heard top fan, Claire, and I was just happy with that.
All right.
Try again.
Yeah, no, I'm a top fan. I learned about your work from the parenting coordination training that I did with Belinda and Karen, who are both here today. And then I just read more and more about your work, and Robert Emery and Mark Cummings and all of these people. And we've got a website, parentingcoordination.co.uk, and many of my blogs and our blogs are all around the topics that you've been talking about today. So the paper that you mentioned is available online freely, actually. You can Google it, and I would highly commend it to everybody. And some of the ideas that you've been talking about, we write about regularly, but I think it's practice changing type stuff that all of mediators should know about fundamentally. That's all I'd say. Thank you
so much, and I hope the presentation lived up to your expectations. I was a bit rushed there, but I hope it worked. But thank you so much for that feedback.
We got the fan page out of the way. So Adrienne.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that really is fascinating, and absolutely agree with Claire. All mediators should know about all the things that you've been talking about, and I'm sure we'd all love to know a lot more about it. What I was particularly interested in, well, there's so many things I was interested in, but particularly when you talked at the end about the potential use of a specifically designed checklist or assessment process for mediators to use, potentially with parents, to help them understand the impact of their relationship and the conflict within their relationship on their children. I think that is a fascinating idea, and I'd love to talk to you more about that at another point, whether we do that through maybe the Family Solutions group, Helen, if I'm not sure if Helen's still with us, but I think that's a really interesting idea to try and improve the way we work, because that's what we're doing at the moment, isn't it? We're looking at constantly ways to improve what we're doing and improve outcomes for children.
So, Mike, if I can take just 60 seconds to try to encourage that conversation further, Adrienne. So just to explain how that's done, and you will know. So if I want to assess the presence of mental health symptom profiles in a young person, are they problematic or not problematic? I might use a questionnaire called the Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire. People will have heard of that. If not, the Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire is a standard clinical screening tool that allows me 25 questions to administer to a young person from age about 4 up. And based on the pattern of responses to those questions, I can calibrate that particular set of scores against population norms. And I'm able to say that person is above or not above population averages for that emotional problems, behavioral problems. It's a bit like blood pressure, height, population norms, same thing. So we have population norms for mental health symptoms, and based on that, we would refer to for further assessment. We can do the same with questions around the interparental relationship dynamic and parenting specifics. And based on large population studies, we've developed a tool that allows you to do that based on the questions being asked. So the Reducing Parental Conflict program with the DWP, we developed a one-side A4 screening tool, referral-based questionnaire, which is levels of exposure to these features of conflict between parents relative to where we got population averages. And that's what allows the referral into next steps. So when that simple association is presented in an accessible way to a couple in terms of here's your child's score or children's scores against the features that are typical for your relationship, here's the association, that's where the conversation then is more accepting to say, actually, you know, we're not saying you're at fault or causing, but there's an association here. So on the balance of probabilities, what your child is experiencing is distressing. And not in every instance will that work, but in a lot of instances, it does work. And I think that's where the evidence base is much stronger now, is to hand over tools to you that you are trained up on using. The complex statistics that's behind it is for others to affirm, but just training up in fundamental practice, that's where I think we're in a much stronger place than we were, say, 5 years or so ago.
Thank you. Juliet.
Hi, thank you very much, Gordon. That was really interesting. I've got a practice question. I saw a teenage boy a couple of days ago whose parents are in court for a child inclusive session, and I'm seeing the parents this evening. So I'm picking your collective brains. pretty smart people, and they would respond well to a couple of links to academic bits of research. But in your opinion, Gordon, what's the best one to point them to? Their conflict is based around silence, as in they avoid each other like the plague. And I just wanted to give them something to read.
In terms of child impacts.
Yeah, because they'll lap it up, you know, they'll want to read it. So there's lots of different references you get.
Yeah. So I think the paper that Claire said was freely available is probably the paper I'd recommend. There's a section in there that links conflict between couples in the context of divorce very specifically. So therefore it would be more straightforward for you to join up the why you're giving that piece of research as a reference reading. But the entire article is around impacts on children. So I would suggest that. So that's in the slide that Mike has and the reference, etc. But that, you know, if you've got difficulties, I mean, would it be helpful, Mike, if I just emailed you that paper to send around to people?
If you can email it to me, then I will make sure that goes out with the pack.
Right. So I'll do that as soon as I come off. I'll send you a PDF of that paper.
Good.
Yeah.
Okay, any other questions or observations I'd like to put in there? Or it's quite helpful putting it into a case example. And I suppose my question is, how do we make sure we use this information positively in the mediation process rather than the challenge to parents, especially with very young children? I was not surprised, actually. It's a shame I'm not surprised that you're seeing the self-harm and things like that in 7-year-olds. It's surprising. It's not surprising now. So I think with some of those younger parents, how do we use this kind of information cleverly? And I think that's something that Adrian and Jane will be picking up on later on in the workshops session. But if we've got no more questions, that's great, because we are still slightly behind on time. So thank you, Gordon. That's really, really helpful. And if